For the first time in FIFA World Cup history, a Central Asian nation had arrived. Not as a guest, not as a wild card, as a team that had earned its place through 7 qualifying campaigns. 31 years of trying, and 1 generation of players who refused to accept that the world's biggest stage was built for everyone else but them. Behind that arrival stood a country most viewers had never thought about. A country that is one of only 2 doubly landlocked nations on Earth. A country whose cities once anchored the Silk Road and whose scholars once mapped the stars. A country that speaks a language the world rarely hears, cooks a rice dish so sacred it has been inscribed by UNESCO, and carries in its football history one of the most devastating tragedies the sport has ever known. Uzbekistan did not arrive quietly. It arrived carrying all of that: the history, the grief, the 31 years of near misses, and 38 million people who had been waiting longer than most football nations have been playing the game. This is the story of Uzbekistan, how its people live, what they have endured, what they have built, and what it means for a nation of ancient roads and modern dreams to step, at last, onto the world's biggest stage. Uzbekistan occupies 448,978 square kilometers of Central Asia. It is roughly the size of California, or Sweden, or Morocco, large enough to contain deserts, mountain foothills, fertile valleys, and river basins, but positioned in a part of the world that most global media coverage treats as empty space between Russia and China. The geography is defined by extremes. The Kizilkum Desert covers much of the western half of the country. A vast, flat, sun-blasted expanse where summer temperatures exceed 45 degrees Celsius, and where the wind moves sand across distances that would swallow European countries whole. The eastern half, by contrast, is fed by the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers, 2 lifelines that have sustained civilizations for millennia, and without which the entire region would be uninhabitable. Between the desert and the mountains lies the Fergana Valley, one of the most densely populated and agriculturally productive areas in Central Asia. The valley is shared by Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and its borders are among the most complex on the continent. A Soviet-era cartographic puzzle that still produces political tension. But the valley itself is abundant: cotton, wheat, fruits, silk, and a human density that has made this region the cultural engine of Uzbek life for centuries. The country is surrounded on all sides by other landlocked nations. Kazakhstan to the north, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to the east, Afghanistan to the south, and Turkmenistan to the west. Uzbekistan is the first doubly landlocked country, surrounded entirely by other landlocked nations, ever to reach a World Cup. That single geographic fact, the sheer distance from the sea, from ports, from the global shipping routes that define modern economic geography, has shaped everything. Trade is harder, logistics cost more, global connection requires more effort. And yet, for centuries, Uzbekistan was not isolated. It was the center. The Silk Road, the network of overland trade routes that connected China to the Mediterranean, did not merely pass through Uzbekistan. It rested here. The cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva were among the most important nodes in the system, places where goods changed hands, languages mixed, religions collided, knowledge was exchanged, and the world, in a very real sense, met itself. Silk, spices, paper, horses, ideas, and diseases moved through these cities for over 1,000 years. The architecture that survives. The turquoise-tiled madrasas, the towering minarets, the caravanserais whose walls still stand, is not decorative. It is the physical evidence of a place that once mattered more to global commerce than London or New York. The climate that shapes daily life is continental and merciless. Winters can drop below -20 in the northern steppe. Summers routinely exceed 40 degrees. The wind, constant in the west, carrying dust from the dried bed of the Aral Sea, is not romantic. It is abrasive, alkaline, and, in parts of Karakalpakstan, medically harmful. Rainfall is scarce in most of the country, and water, its management, its scarcity, its political implications, is perhaps the single most important resource issue in Uzbekistan today. The landscape is not gentle. It does not invite the casual visitor. It demands adaptation, endurance, and a relationship with the earth that is older than any government. Uzbekistan has approximately 38 million inhabitants, making it the most populous country in Central Asia by a significant margin. But the question of who these people are is layered with the kind of historical complexity that no demographic statistic can capture. The Uzbek population is predominantly ethnically Uzbek, a Turkic-speaking people whose cultural roots reach back to the nomadic confederations that dominated the Central Asian steppe and to the settled civilizations that built the Silk Road cities. But Uzbek as a national identity is, in its modern form, a 20th century construction. The borders of Uzbekistan were drawn by Soviet cartographers in the 1920s and 1930s, often cutting through ethnic, linguistic, and cultural boundaries that had existed for centuries. Tajik-speaking communities live in Samarkand and Bukhara. Karakalpaks, a distinct Turkic group, inhabit the Autonomous Republic of Karakalpakstan in the west. Russian, Korean, Tatar, and other minorities add further layers. The language spoken at home, in markets, in arguments, in love, and on the football terraces is Uzbek, a Turkic language written in the Latin script since the mid-1990s, after decades of Cyrillic under Soviet rule. Russian remains widely spoken, particularly in Tashkent and among the older generation, and it functions as a lingua franca for business and regional communication. Many Uzbeks also speak Tajik. And in the Fergana Valley, the linguistic boundaries between Uzbek, Tajik, and Kyrgyz are fluid in ways that would confuse a European sociolinguist. The demographic structure of Uzbekistan is extraordinarily young. The median age is around 28. More than half the population is under 30. This is not a country of retirees contemplating the past. It is a country of students, young workers, aspiring entrepreneurs, recent graduates, and children. A massive youth bulge that represents both the country's greatest resource and its most urgent challenge. Jobs must be created, housing must be built, education must be delivered, and the aspirations of a generation raised on smartphones, social media, and global connectivity must be met by an economy that is still developing. The family is the foundational unit of Uzbek social life, and it operates with a gravity that is difficult to overstate. Extended families maintain close ties. Major decisions, marriage, education, career, residence, are rarely made by individuals alone. The youngest son traditionally inherits the family home and the responsibility of caring for elderly parents. Weddings are not private affairs. They are community events, involving hundreds of guests, enormous quantities of food, live music, and social obligations that can place significant financial pressure on families. A wedding in Uzbekistan is not an invitation you decline lightly. The mahalla, the traditional neighborhood community, functions as an intermediary institution between the family and the state. In the mahalla, neighbors know each other, share celebrations and sorrows, resolve minor disputes, and maintain a social surveillance that is simultaneously supportive and controlling. The mahalla system has been formalized by the government and used for everything from distributing social assistance to organizing local governance. For many Uzbeks, particularly outside Tashkent, the mahalla is where real life happens, not in government offices, not on television, but in the conversations, obligations, and mutual dependencies of the people who live on your street. The hospitality of Uzbekistan is not a cliché, it is a deeply internalized social code. A guest in an Uzbek home will be offered tea before any conversation begins. Bread, naan, will be placed on the table with reverence and never turned upside down. Food will appear in quantities that seem irrational for the number of people present. Football arrived in Uzbekistan in 1912, when the first teams were formed in Kokand. Reportedly after locals watched Russian soldiers playing a casual version of the sport in the Fergana region. From those first informal matches in the cotton-growing towns of the valley, the game spread. The first championship of the Fergana Valley was held in 1914. The Uzbekistan SSR Championship was established in 1926. Football became embedded in the social fabric of Soviet Uzbekistan. Not because Moscow mandated it, but because the sport attached itself to something in the Uzbek temperament. The combination of individual skill and collective effort, the drama of competition, the way a goal can unite a crowd that agrees on nothing else. The most successful club in the Soviet period was FC Paktakor, the only Uzbek football club that played in the USA Top League. The name means cotton picker, a reference to the crop that defined the republic's economy and identity. Paktakor was the only Central Asian club to appear in a Soviet Cup final, and then came August 11, 1979. The tragedy. On the morning of August 11, 1979, two passenger jets collided in the skies over Soviet Ukraine. One of them was carrying the first team squad of Paktakor Tashkent, the pride of Uzbek football, on their way to a league fixture. 17 players and staff were killed instantly. A club that represented the sporting soul of a republic lost almost an entire generation of footballers in a few seconds, and the grief rippled across Uzbekistan for decades. It would take a full week for the official version of events to reach Tashkent. By that point, the capital was already ensconced in grief. Feeding off foreign radio reports and hearsay, a numb, shocked crowd of thousands had gathered outside the club's storied stadium. The Soviet League voted to protect the club from relegation for the next 3 seasons and ordered the other member clubs to each lend a player to Paktakor to see them through the 1979 season. 3 years after the crash that had wiped out most of the squad, Paktakor ended the season in 6th place, their highest ever finish in the Soviet League. The club survived, but the wound never fully closed. You cannot tell the story of Uzbek football without returning to that 1979 disaster, because it shaped everything that followed. Every near miss in World Cup qualifying, every agonizing exit, every generation of players that fell short, carried with it the silent weight of the team that never came home. Annually, in August, the club sponsors a youth tournament in memory of the people lost. In August 2009, 30 years after the crash, a monument was unveiled near the site of the collision. In a small Ukrainian village, thousands of kilometers from the stadium, where the fans still chant the old names. The names of all team members are engraved on it. At the foot sits a granite soccer ball. Above it, a stone swan. The granite soccer ball and the stone swan are perhaps the most quietly devastating monument in the history of the sport. The road after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan gained independence and organized a new national team. The first match was held in 1992, a game against Tajikistan. In 1994, the Uzbekistan Football Federation was officially recognized by the AFC and FIFA. The decision to join the Asian Football Confederation rather than UEFA was consequential. It placed Uzbekistan in a competitive landscape dominated by Japan, South Korea, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Australia. Nations with vastly greater resources and deeper footballing infrastructure. But the early results were stunning. At the 1994 Asian Games, Uzbekistan shocked South Korea with a 1-0 victory to advance to the final, then defeated China 4-2 to capture the title. Just 2 years after the national team's creation, Uzbekistan's first attempt to qualify for the World Cup was in 1998. They did not make it. Nor did they make it for 2002, 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, or 2022. 7 campaigns, 7 failures, 31 years of trying. The most painful of those failures came in 2005. A refereeing error in the first leg of the playoff against Bahrain led FIFA to order a replay. Bahrain ultimately advanced on away goals. That loss is still discussed in Uzbek football circles, the way certain defeats are discussed in countries where a single match defines a generation. Except that in Uzbekistan, the pain was not softened by the knowledge that another chance would come soon. In Asian qualifying, chances are rare, margins are thin, and the next cycle is 4 years away. And then the format changed, with Asia now having 8 guaranteed qualifiers in the new 48-team World Cup. Uzbekistan was finally a serious contender. The qualification Uzbekistan began their journey toward the 2026 World Cup in the second round of AFC qualifiers, where they finished level on points with Iran at 14 points apiece, posting an unbeaten 4-0-2 record, while handling business comfortably against Hong Kong and Turkmenistan. They carried that momentum into the third round, landing in a group alongside the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kyrgyzstan, and North Korea. The White Wolves punched their direct ticket to North America by securing second place behind Iran, racking up 21 points with a 6-1-3 record. The driving force throughout was Abosbek Fayzulayev, a 22-year-old whose goals proved decisive at the critical moments. The cities. The football world suddenly had reason to learn about Samarkand, Bukhara, and Khiva. Cities that predate every football league on earth by more than a millennium. Samarkand is perhaps the single most architecturally overwhelming city in Central Asia. The Registan, a public square flanked by 3 enormous madrasas covered in turquoise, cobalt, and gold tilework, is not a ruin, It is a statement of civilizational ambition that has survived Mongol invasion, Soviet modernization, and the entropy of time. Alexander the Great captured it. Timur made it his capital and brought artisans from across the conquered world to build it. Ulugh Beg, Timur's grandson, constructed an astronomical observatory here in the 15th century that produced star catalogues of remarkable precision. Bukhara is different. Where Samarkand overwhelms, Bukhara accumulates. Its old city is a dense weave of mosques, madrasas, trading domes, and narrow streets that have been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. The Kalyan minaret, so imposing that Genghis Khan, legend has it, spared it during the sack of the city, still stands. The Ark Fortress, seat of the emirs who ruled the Bukhara Khanate, still anchors the skyline. Khiva is the smallest and most visually complete of the three. Its inner-walled city, Ichan Kala, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site that functions as a kind of open-air museum, except that people still live and work inside the walls. The tiled minarets, the carved wooden doors, the low adobe structures that seem to grow from the earth rather than having been built on it. All of this creates an atmosphere that is intensely evocative and slightly disorienting, as if you have stepped through a door in time. But for the people who live in these cities, the monuments are not the point. The point is the chaikhana, where tea is served. The point is the bazaar, where prices are negotiated with theatrical intensity. The point is the wedding hall that books out months in advance. The point is the bread being slapped against the inside wall of a tandoor oven at 5 in the morning. These are living cities. The history is magnificent. The daily life is ordinary, and the combination of the two is what makes Uzbekistan unlike any other country in the world. No understanding of Uzbekistan is complete without understanding the food. Because the food is not a category of experience separate from social life. It is social life. Plov is the center. It is a dish of rice cooked in a large quantity of oil or animal fat with carrots, meat, usually lamb or beef, onions, and spices, cumin, coriander, barberries, garlic, chickpeas. In some regional variations, it is cooked in a kazan, a massive cast iron pot, over an open fire, and it is typically prepared by men, in large quantities, for communal events, weddings, funerals, holidays, circumcisions, and gatherings of any consequence. A single kazan of plov can feed 200 people. The dish is not merely food, it is ritual, identity, and social currency. Beyond plov, the Uzbek table is deep, shurpa, a dense, slow-cooked soup of lamb, potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, and peppers. Manti, large steamed dumplings filled with minced meat and onion, eaten with sour cream or vinegar. Somsa, triangular or round pastries baked in a tandoor, filled with meat, pumpkin, or greens. Lagman, hand-pulled noodles in a spiced broth with vegetables and meat, a dish that reveals the Chinese influence on Central Asian cuisine. And the bread, non, round, stamped with decorative patterns, baked fresh every morning, never placed upside down on a table, and treated with a reverence that borders on the sacred. The wound. There is a part of Uzbekistan that the World Cup broadcasts will not show, but that every Uzbek carries in some corner of their consciousness. The Aral Sea. Or rather, what was the Aral Sea? Once the fourth largest inland body of water on Earth. The Aral Sea straddled the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. Soviet-era irrigation projects, designed to turn the Central Asian steppe into a cotton-producing powerhouse, diverted the rivers that fed the sea. The Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, which had sustained the Aral for millennia, were channeled into canals that watered cotton fields. The sea began to shrink, and it kept shrinking. By the early 2000s, the Aral Sea had lost more than 90% of its volume. Fishing communities that had existed for generations found themselves stranded dozens of kilometers from the receding shoreline. The city of Moynak, once a bustling port, became a graveyard of rusted ships sitting on dry sand. One of the most photographed environmental disasters in modern history. The ecological consequences extend far beyond the lakebed. The exposed seabed is saturated with salt, pesticides, and chemical residues from decades of agricultural runoff. When the wind blows, and in western Uzbekistan, the wind always blows, it carries these particles across the region, creating respiratory and health problems for communities downwind. Karakalpakstan, the autonomous republic in northwestern Uzbekistan, that bore the brunt of the disaster, has some of the highest rates of respiratory illness, anemia, and certain cancers in Central Asia. The Aral Sea disaster is not ancient history. It is ongoing. It is the environmental cost of an agricultural model that prioritized production over sustainability. And it is a wound that the country is still trying to address through reforestation, water management reform, and international cooperation. The Generation, the country's president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, has described the team as a symbol of a new Uzbekistan. Part of what he calls a golden generation of Uzbek youth now making their mark in sports, culture, and science, and even chess. The phrase is used loosely in football. In Uzbekistan, it refers to something broader. A cohort of young people born after independence who are, for the first time, achieving global visibility. Vast resources have been poured into building youth facilities across the country, and at youth level, the results have been visible. Twice over the past decade and a half, Uzbekistan reached the FIFA Under-17 World Cup quarter-finals. They reached the last 16 at the Under-20 World Cup. The Olympic team qualified for Paris. But the golden generation is not only footballers. It is programmers in Tashkent, writing code for international clients. It is students winning mathematics Olympiads. It is chess players competing at the highest levels. Uzbekistan's chess team won the Chess Olympiad in 2022. An achievement that stunned the global chess community. It is young women starting businesses, teaching at universities, and pushing against social boundaries that their mothers could not have challenged. It is a generation that speaks Uzbek, Russian, and increasingly English, that watches Turkish television, Korean dramas, and American content online, that uses Telegram as its primary communication platform and Instagram as its social stage. This generation is not naive about the challenges their country faces. They know the economy is developing, not developed. They know the political system is not what they see in Western democracies. They know that many of their peers have left for Russia, Turkey, South Korea, or the Gulf states to work and send remittances home. They know that the World Cup is 3 weeks, and that the structural problems of their country, water scarcity, unemployment, infrastructure gaps, education reform, will not be solved by a football tournament. But they also know that visibility matters. The World Cup has given Uzbekistan something that decades of diplomatic effort, economic reform, and cultural promotion could not. global attention. But attention is a temporary condition. The question that hangs over the country, as it hangs over every small nation that achieves a breakthrough on the world stage, is what happens when the cameras leave. The economy is growing, but it is still classified as lower middle income. The population is young, but youth without opportunity produces frustration, not progress. The government has invested heavily in football infrastructure, but the same government faces questions about political openness, press freedom, and the pace of institutional reform. The diaspora, hundreds of thousands of Uzbeks working abroad, sends money home that sustains families but also represents a drain of human capital that the country can ill afford. The football itself faces structural questions. The domestic league does not have the financial resources, the broadcast deals, or the international profile to retain top talent. The best Uzbek players will continue to develop abroad, which creates a national team that is, in some ways, a product of other countries' football systems. That is not unique to Uzbekistan. It is the reality for dozens of smaller footballing nations, but it means that the pipeline must be maintained, the academies must keep producing, and the emotional connection between diaspora players and the national team must be nurtured across thousands of kilometers and multiple time zones. The players representing Uzbekistan in 2026 are the inheritors of a culture that endured one of football's worst tragedies and kept loving the game anyway. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole story. In the mahallas of the old city, neighbors gathered around television sets placed in courtyards, replaying the goal on their phones, arguing about whether the second-half defensive shape was too deep, praising Kusanov's positioning, debating whether Shomorodov should have been brought on earlier or later. The conversations were loud, opinionated, and conducted over tea that had been refilled so many times the pot had lost count. In the Chorsu Bazaar, which had closed hours earlier, the vendors had left their stalls but not their conversations. A melon seller who had watched the match on his phone between customers told anyone who would listen that he had predicted the goal. A bread vendor who had been baking naan since 4 a.m. said she did not care about football, but that her son had cried, and that was enough. In Samarkand, in the shadow of the Registan, a group of university students had projected the match onto a wall. When the goal went in, the sound that came from that square, mixing with the call to prayer from the nearby mosque and the honking of cars on the ring road, was a sound that Samarkand had not made in quite that way before. It was the sound of a city that had hosted Alexander, Timur, and Ulugh Beg, now hosting something entirely new, a World Cup goal. In Moynak, in the far northwest, where the rusted ships sit on the dry bed of the Aral Sea, a teenager watched the match on a satellite connection that cut out twice during the second half. He did not know the names of all the players. He had never been to Tashkent. He had never seen a football stadium in person. But when the ball crossed the line, he stood up from the plastic chair in front of his family's house and shouted into the wind, the same wind that carries salt from the Dead Sea, the same wind that has blown across this land for longer than anyone can remember. In the Netherlands, in Rotterdam and Amsterdam and The Hague, Uzbek communities watched in restaurants and living rooms. Some of them had left Uzbekistan years ago, some had never been, but the flag on the screen was their flag, and the goal was their goal, and the country was their country, even if their passports said something else. And in a village near Kamyanske, Ukraine, the site where two planes collided in 1979, The granite soccer ball at the foot of the Pakhtakor Memorial sat in silence, as it has sat for years, marking the place where Uzbek football's darkest chapter began. That is the truth about what happened on June 17, 2026. A country that lost its best footballers in a plane crash 47 years ago. That rebuilt from nothing, that gained independence and spent 31 years trying to reach a tournament that the rest of the world takes for granted. That country scored a goal in a World Cup, and for one evening, 38 million people scattered across deserts and oases and ancient cities and cotton fields and mahallas where everyone knows everyone, felt the same thing at the same time. That is what the World Cup does. Not the tactics, not the rankings, not the television revenue or the sponsorship deals. It takes a country and makes it visible. It takes a history and gives it a stage. It takes a grief and turns it, for one evening, into joy. Whatever happens in Group K, this squad has already made history as the first Central Asian side to reach the sport's biggest stage. Uzbekistan arrived, and the world, finally, was watching.